Good evening, y'all. My name is Kel Carter, and today I want to welcome you to the start of the infantry series of Black units in World War II. And what better unit to start off with than the 24th Infantry Regiment? Now, the 24th Infantry Regiment on the eve of World War II was arguably among the most experienced Black units in the U.S. Army. And the reason for that being was because the 24th Infantry, like the 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, were formed in the aftermath of the Civil War and thus saw continual service from 1866 up until the eve of World War II. Now, in the case of the 24th Infantry Regiment, during the interwar period, they were initially sent to Fort Benning, Georgia in 1922. And the reason for that was that they were going to serve as school troops for the infantry school that is at Fort Benning, Georgia, was then and still is today. So, and the ideology behind it is that they would serve as demonstration troops to show how infantry tactics were how they're supposed to do infantry tactics, as well as demonstrate, in addition to demonstrating to the troops, also demonstrating the tactics, the weapons, and everything else. Now, in addition to serving as soldiers, a part of the infantry school at Fort Benning, they also assisted in overseeing the district of, the H district of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Of course, Civilian Conservation Corps was a part of numerous programs that came out of part of the New Deal, which was to try to help preserve like natural, do like construction and stuff like that. Getting tongue-tied. I apologize for that. So, the 24th ended up overseeing the construction, the Civilian Conservation Corps, primarily in District H of the 4th Corps area in the 1930s. Now, 4th Corps included Georgia, South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, and parts of Alabama as well. So, now, the last thing to keep in mind, too, is that right before the start of World War II, the 24th Infantry Regiment possibly participated in the Carolina maneuvers, which took place in late 1941. Now, the Carolina maneuvers was a part of a larger series of maneuvers that the U.S. Army did on the eve of World War II to, in essence, to problem solve how they would use forces and figure out use the military units in the upcoming war, as well as figure out how to restructure the army. Now, the more famous of the maneuvers is the Louisiana maneuvers, which took place in early to mid 1941. But you also had the Tennessee maneuvers and, of course, the aforementioned Carolina maneuvers. Now, when World War II, the U.S. officially declared war and entered World War II, the 24th Infantry Regiment was among the first Black regiments to actually be deployed overseas. And not just the first Black regiments, among the first Black combat regiments to be deployed. Now, they were deployed in April of 1942, and they landed in the South Pacific Islands, specifically the New Hebrides Islands. I apologize for mispronunciation, but they landed on those islands in May 1942. Now, to place that within the broader context of what was going on during that time period, in May 1942, this is where you start seeing the U.S. turn the tide against the Japanese in the Pacific. In May 1942, that's when we had the Battle of the Coral Sea, which, even though the battle ended in a draw, it was technically a battle that really didn't have any clear victor. It did prevent the Japanese from continuing their expansion into the South Pacific. And then, of course, June, you had the Battle of Midway. So by the time August occurs in 1942, you start having the earliest offensive operations in the Pacific, which included the landings at Guadalcanal. Now, what was the 24th doing during this period then? From pretty much May 1942 to about early 1943, the 24th Infantry was deployed alongside Seabees to assist in the construction of airfields and can help with the construction of garrisons that will be manned by U.S. forces and other Allied forces. And they continued this, as I said before, until about early 1943. Now, excuse me. when 1943 comes along, the 24th Infantry was attached to the 14th Corps, and the vast majority of the regiment was sent to Guadalcanal with the purpose of seeing garrison duty as well as assisting with mop-up operations. But a battalion was sent to Bougainville in 1944. Now, while that battalion was at Bougainville, which was officially the 1st Battalion of the 24th Infantry, they were attached to various elements, various white divisions that were seeing service on Bougainville, including the 37th Infantry Division, as well as the Maricall Division, which was a part of, which later became the 23rd Infantry Division. And while there, the 1st Battalion that was attached to these white regiments assisted in bolstering the defensive perimeter that was the U.S. defensive perimeter on Bougainville in 1944. So while on Bougainville, the 24th did see combat, but what you end up learning from observing this part of the 24th is that while they did see combat, most of the combat was either defensive operations, i.e., preventing the Japanese from overrunning the defense perimeter and thus attacking the vital American airfields, or doing mop-up operations consisting of looking out for the Japanese remnant forces that were either left behind or were harassing Allied forces during the occupation of those islands. So the 24th continued this until about late 1944. Now, in late 1944, the 24th Infantry Regiment was reassigned to Saipan and Tinian. And while in Saipan and Tinian, their goals was to help protect the heavy bomber airfields, the B-29 airfields, as well as conduct mop-up operations looking for remnant Japanese forces that may be hiding on the island. Now, and this leads to an interesting point that a lot of people, that makes the Pacific theater to me very interesting, is that whereas in the Mediterranean theater of operations, like i.e. Italy, North Africa, and in the European theater of operations, such as Normandy and Brittany and stuff like that, while in most cases when Axis forces surrendered in those areas, they surrendered and overall those areas would be secure. In the Pacific theater, it was not the case. In the Pacific theater, what would happen is that, and you actually see this throughout the major battles like Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, and where they would have the U.S. forces would battle the Japanese forces. And after a certain amount of time, when the Japanese forces either were nearly overall decimated or rendered a non-factor, the U.S. military, the U.S. Marines, or the U.S. Army would declare the island secure. Now, the island being secure doesn't mean that there's no Japanese forces there. There's still Japanese forces there. They've just been made redundant, or to a point to where that Allied forces can easily counteract them. So, in the case of the 24th, most of their war record from Bougainville onward is basically deploying to these islands and assisting and providing mop-up operations. Basically looking for those remnant Japanese forces and ideally capturing them if necessary, but if necessary, eliminating them. So the 24th stayed in Saipan and Tinian up until from late 1944 till about early to mid 1945. Now, once mid 1945 came along, they were reassigned from Saipan and Tinian to the Okinawan island chain, specifically Kerama Island. Now, again, their job there was to oversee garrison duty, protect the airfields, but also conduct mop-up operations. Now, one of the interesting things that occurred while the 24th was based in Okinawa is that a small Japanese garrison on one of the islands actually surrendered to elements of the 24th Infantry Regiment. And of course, it's not while it may not seem as big of a deal, what the significance of this is that mostly in most cases, most Japanese garrisons, particularly in the Pacific Theater, had a tendency to fight on to the last, meaning that the only way that the Japanese would be handled is pretty much a fight to the death. So the fact that a small garrison surrendered to the 24th is pretty much praiseworthy in itself. But the 24th Infantry Regiment pretty much ended World War II in the Okinawa Islands. Now, what makes this unique is that at the end of World War II, the 24th Infantry Regiment becomes among the last of the original Buffalo Soldiers. And by the time 1946, 1947 comes around, they are literally the last of the original Buffalo Soldiers. And the reason why that is stated is because as I will mention in future videos covering the 24, the other Buffalo Soldier regiments, a lot of the Buffalo Soldier regiments were either deactivated during World War II or immediately after. So the 24th managed to soldier on, and in fact, when the Korean War first starts in 1950, the 24th Infantry is among the first units to be deployed to the Korean Peninsula to fight against the North Korean invasion. Now, one of the things that may come up when people see this video, they may say, well, Kel, you talked about the 24th Infantry Regiment and the Pacific Theater, but they didn't see as much combat as, say, for example, the 366th Infantry or the 370th, or in the case of other regiments, they didn't see as much combat. So why are you notating this? Why are you talking about this unit? Well, one, in terms of these global wars, particularly World War II, not every unit sees a lot of combat. But two, and thus the history should still be preserved. But another thing is that when it comes to a lot of the black units, particularly black units that were deployed to the Pacific Theater of Operations and even the Mediterranean Theater of Operations, a lot of the commanding officers who oversaw these units, they had a mindset that can be traced directly back to the Army War College study in the 1920s that said, well, black soldiers were physically capable of serving in the military, but they were not mentally capable of military service. And keep in mind, a lot of these officers in the U.S. Army at the time, during that time, and you can even make the argument, even still, were mostly Southerners who had a certain viewpoint of black American soldiers or black Americans in general. So, as a result, it's not to say that these soldiers wouldn't have proved themselves in combat. In fact, in the few cases where you do have them fighting in skirmishes with the Japanese or in other battles, they do prove themselves worthy. They do prove themselves as competent soldiers. It's just the fact that a lot of systemic oppression and ideals that were more socially acceptable at the time prevented these soldiers from seeing service. And in turn, because of those predominant ideas at the time, that led to a lot of the history of these soldiers, such as the black soldiers in the 24th Infantry Regiment and black soldiers in other regiments, being largely forgotten, because when we look at military history, we tend to glorify those not only who saw combat, but those who had meticulous records. And in the case of the 24th, while the 24th does have an overall meticulous record, in terms of combat, they didn't see as much combat. So therefore, by certain standards, they may not get the same amount of praise that other units would receive. But, so, I say all that to say that, in essence, even though they may not have the super bombastic, like, war stories that we enjoy hearing, they're still part of history, no less, and they still deserve to have their time in the sun. And after all, like, there may be someone who may be a descendant of someone from the 24th Infantry Regiment or any of these other black regiments I will be covering, and they may want to know what their ancestor went through, or at least a summarization of what their ancestor went through. So, with that note, I want to take the time to thank y'all for tuning in and watching this video. I'm gonna try to basically get better about shortening the video because I know people don't want to sit and hear me talk all the time. But like I said, I want to take time to thank y'all for watching this video. Thank y'all for supporting me throughout this entire endeavor. And I will see you guys next time.